Waiting.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Green Party series. I am your host, David Rych, with my co-host, Calvin Tomaschko. Calvin, how are you?
Hey, doing great tonight. Can't wait to talk.
Great. We have a special guest tonight, David Kraft, the founder of NEIS, Nuclear Energy Information Services, an anti-nuclear power organization, bringing awareness of what's all the atrocities and the concerns about nuclear power specifically. David, thank you, and welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's good to be here. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Great. So let's, without further ado, let's get right into it because this is a very important issue. We were just talking off the show about some of the importance of nuclear awareness and what's going on. A lot of people with nuclear weapons and that kind of thing don't attend to this issue anymore. They think it's passé. They think, oh, it's never going to happen, blah, 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 things like that. And if I remember correctly, I don't remember what year it was, but I remember being very frightened when India and Pakistan were about to nuke each other in the early 2000s. It was all over the news, and I couldn't believe it. I'm like, I never thought in my entire life that this would happen. It did not happen, thankfully. But I remember it seemed like it was getting very, very close. And let's not first forget a lot of people's lifetime that the Cuban Missile Crisis was deferred by probably a couple of minutes, maybe. It almost happened. And so there's all sorts of probably unspoken tales, too, that we're not aware of. So, David, without further ado, please take the center stage here and let us know about how you founded it, why you founded NEIS, the mission, and we'll go from there.
Okay, thank you. NEIS, I'm a co-founder, actually. There were 7 of us who met in my living room one evening to decide to create the group. This was back in 1981, 2 years after the 3 Mile Island accident in Pennsylvania. In some ways, when people ask me, how do I come to this issue, I say it was by accident, and it happened to be that accident. But we formed NEIS to take a different approach towards the issue. After the 3 Mile Island accident, a lot of demonstrations took place around the country. There was a No Nukes concert, which was very famous. Many musicians showed up for it. But after 2 or 3 years, the hoopla died down, and the nuclear weapons issues became much more prominent under Ronald Reagan's administration. So since then, nuclear power has taken pretty much a back seat. But our focus at the time, was to translate a very complicated, arcane, somewhat scientific issue into language that Joe and Josephine Couch Potato could understand so that they could actually relate to it and understand how much it affected them daily. Now, in Illinois, in particular, this was important because even back then, Illinois had more nuclear reactors than any other state, as it still does today.
Wow.
In its heyday, we had 14 operating reactors here in Illinois, which made us the 11th largest nuclear power in the world, just behind Ukraine at one point, and China. Things have changed, of course. We've actually closed 3 of the reactors down, so we're only operating 11, but we're still the largest nuclear generator in the country. Along with having the most reactors, you end up with the most high-level radioactive waste, too, which is another problem that we have not solved yet. So our intention was to take these issues, try and make them understandable to people, and explain to them not only why was this important environmentally, but certainly economically, because back then, as now, Commonwealth Edison and the Exelon Corporation today had a very strong stranglehold on the politics of the state, the finances of the state, and they pretty much got their way. Governor Thompson, Republican governor back in the 80s, never denied a rate hike that had anything to do with nuclear power. He was definitely a pro-nuclear advocate. So we ended up with all these reactors, all of this waste, and now, I imagine later in the show today, we'll talk about the political situation, which is at the moment in the process of getting rid of all of the coal plants, gas plants, and hopefully nuclear plants by the year 2050. So this is how we came to be. This is what we're trying to do. And as much as we are against nuclear, we have always been very much in favor of a renewable energy future. And that has taken different forms as the technology has evolved over the last 40 years of our existence. Before you used to think about it in terms of wind turbines and solar and geothermal. Now it's becoming much more rich and vast and detailed in the way the technology is driving us to a different energy future. It's much more decentralized, where folks are emphasizing community projects in solar energy, in wind power. We're talking about battery storage and other forms of energy storage, which didn't even exist, 20 years ago. We're talking about better ways of transporting electricity over the long power lines that we use today, much more efficiently than we ever have before. So all of these technological drivers is pushing us in a direction that our organization has been advocating since 2007, which is simply carbon-free, nuclear-free by 2040. And that's pretty much our goal.
It's good goal. Calvin.
Yeah, this is fantastic, and getting to hear a little bit about the history. So Illinois seems to be a big player in the role of the U.S. Energy grid when it pertains to nuclear, especially. And you mentioned a little bit about the history. What have been some milestones along the way in the goal of achieving more renewable energies and deterring away from nuclear?
Uh, I would have to say that the milestones that are important can be viewed as negative ones, in the sense that Commonwealth Edison in its day, and then Exelon, which has succeeded ComEd in terms of owning the nukes, have been probably one of the largest barriers to renewable energy in the state. They have consistently opposed energy efficiency, renewable energy, unless, of course, they owned it. Then, if it was their project, they were in favor of it. They have actively discouraged the import of renewable energy from Iowa as recently as 2 years ago by squelching a deal which would have allowed a transmission connection between Illinois and Iowa. So they're still active players in promoting nuclear and thwarting renewables at every opportunity. So the big changes there have taken place in the last few years. The first is we ended the reign of error, I would call it, of Michael Madigan's House speakership, because under his watchful eye, Exelon and ComEd pretty much got their way also in the state legislature, which again thwarted renewable expansion quite a bit. The second thing is now the fact that the environmental community has come together in ways and organized better than it ever has before, I'd say over the last 6 or 7 years, and have become a very, very effective statewide driving force in galvanizing the important changes that are needed in the legislation to get us to that renewable energy future. And the final piece, and this is taking place in over many issues, is the intersectionality that's taking place between the environmental community and the environmental movement today and the environmental justice movement. Because if you look at energy anywhere, under any circumstance, it's an environmental justice issue. It's always the urban areas benefiting from large power stations and power plants of all kinds, coal, oil, gas, nuclear, and the primitive little brown people all over the world getting screwed by either hosting the waste or getting the pollution, like we saw in Chicago in Little Village and Pilsen with the coal plants that used to operate there. This is a very important intersection between environmental justice and nuclear power. And nuclear is one that I can point to internationally, because you cannot have nuclear power or weapons without uranium mining. And the places that uranium is mined in happen to all be indigenous throughout the world, whether it's the Cree Nation in Canada, the Diné in Southwest United States, the Aborigines in Australia, the Tuareg, I always get their name quite wrong, in Niger, Africa. And Kazakhstan is another country where, again, the local populations have been affected by the uranium mining. Everywhere you have the nuclear fuel chain starting, which is with uranium mining, BIPOC people get screwed. So it's very much an environmental justice issue, and it's being elevated to the importance it deserves by the environmental community here in Illinois. So these are current milestones, but they're the essential ones that's going to transform us from the disruptive and polluting energy past we've had with fossil fuels and nuclear into an age which is more based on renewable energy, a softer path, energy efficiency, and local control.
Okay, well, let's talk. Tell us more about the dangers of nuclear reactors, nuclear power plants. Obviously, it's sort of like just sort of common sense to think of them as dangerous. Nuclear is dangerous. That's why they use them as bombs, because they destroy things. Like I said before, I had talked to some people who advocated nuclear power plants. Actually, I wrote a report in a class a long time ago in college on nuclear energy and that kind of thing. One of the three things I remember was that it was, in fact, the most bang for your buck. That is true, but it was also extremely the waste was, you can't get rid of it, and it's radioactive for forever. And if something goes wrong, something goes really, really wrong, like 3 Mile Island, the thing that happened. I remember what was it in Japan that had a nuclear problem?
Fukushima.
Fukushima, thank you. Yeah, that's probably the most recent one that I know of. It caused a lot of problems. The radiation is bad stuff. So go ahead, if you could speak to the dangers of these things.
When we started our organization in 1981, we had four major objections, which kind of parallel the four horsemen of the apocalypse in a way. You've already touched on a few of them, though. The first is that you always have the potential for a catastrophic disaster. It's what has been referred to over the last decade or so, ever since the book came out, as black swans. Black swans are these high-tech capabilities which have very low probability of something going wrong, but extremely negative consequences if they go wrong. And Fukushima is a perfect example of that. So is Chernobyl, and I'm sure some of you saw the HBO series 2 years ago, give you an example of what that means. So again, the probability of something going wrong is low in many calculations, but the consequence is disastrous. So that's the first one. The second, as you pointed out, is radioactive waste. To date, we have about 80,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste around the country, and we have disposed of 0 ounces of it. It's all sitting around at the reactor sites where they were generated with no place to go after 75 years of the nuclear age. So we have not been very good stewards of radioactive waste. The third obvious thing that people are pointing to is the expense with nuclear. Plants are extremely expensive, always have been, and we have gotten to an almost absurd level of incompetence in terms of cost and the inability to land a project on time. The country only has 2 reactors under construction right now down in Georgia. They are 6 years beyond when they should have started. And they started out with an estimate of $16 billion for 2 reactors. The estimate now for completion is $27 billion for 2 reactors. So they are clearly the most expensive energy projects in the United States. But we're not the worst, because in England they have 2 more expensive ones even. So it just shows you that in any kind of a capitalist system that you operate under, nuclear power just can't cut it. In fact, the situation right now in the legislature of Illinois is that Exelon is seeking subsidies and bailouts because they cannot operate the older reactors they've already built in a cost competitive way in the energy market today. So expense was the third issue. The fourth issue, at least back in the day, and to an extent it still is true, was that nuclear power, in terms of the amount of energy you got, was actually an energy irrelevance. If you were running nuclear maximally, when we first did the calculations back in the 80s and 90s, all of that energy would amount to half of the amount of electricity that we were wasting. So let me let that sink in. We wasted twice as much energy as the entire nuclear fleet of the country was capable of producing. So if we just got a little smarter, like turned off the lights and had better light bulbs and all that stuff, we wouldn't have needed any nuclear plants. So that's what we mean by an energy irrelevance. And that's the calculation you have to do, is how much waste is still happening compared to how much they can actually provide for us. Since then, we've added 3 major issues. The first came about with the various Gulf Wars, because the nuclear industry was realizing the handwriting was on the wall, and they had to come up with excuses for why they should get more government funds and subsidies and stuff. So the first was that nuclear was homegrown and we wouldn't have to import energy from foreign countries. Well, yeah, it's homegrown, that's true. And we don't import electricity from foreign countries. We import oil from foreign countries.
Right.
And unless you operated a nuclear power automobile, those electrons really didn't do squat to, prevent Saddam Hussein from, wreaking havoc on our energy system. So that was bogus in the Gulf War. The second major issue was now, and it's current, that the nuclear industry is selling itself as some sort of a solution to the climate crisis. And we have repeatedly demonstrated the falsehood of that. And we have some animations we've put up on our website about this and can make it available, which shows that nuclear may be, except for coal, the worst option you could pick to deal with the climate crisis. Because, as we pointed out, it's too expensive. It takes too long to build a plant in any numbers that would be having any meaningful effect on the carbon in the atmosphere. And you would have to do it in a way that would save time and not create additional environmental problems that are equally dangerous, which gets us to the last issue, and that everywhere nuclear power goes, you run the risk of nuclear proliferation of materials and weapons.
Yep.
These can be thermonuclear or not, as we saw. You were mentioning earlier the tension between Pakistan and India. Those guys got their nuclear weapons literally from the peaceful atom system that they had in place in their countries, where they were doing research. And just like Iran is doing now, their peaceful atom, use those reactors. So it's just nonsense to think that there's a separation, a meaningful separation between nuclear power and weapons. And you don't have to take my word for it. The former director of the International Energy Agency, Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, Mohammed Al-Baradei, was pointing out that nuclear power, especially in the Middle East, where they're trying to build reactors now, is a surefire path of destabilizing the region and bringing nuclear weapons into a more critical position. So those were the 7 objections that we have had to nuclear power over time. They've evolved over the 40 years. Right now, I think the biggest one we are emphasizing, though, is that nuclear cannot, under any circumstances, be counted on as a primary solution to the climate crisis.
Calvin, I can't hear you.
Fun mistakes. Just showing our pretty faces here. This is the Illinois Green Party series. We are going on Facebook and YouTube every Monday night. If you guys have any suggestions or just want to say hi, please drop a note in the comment and maybe we'll get some time to respond to it. All right, coming back. Oh, that was a lot to take in, and it's really profound stuff. Yeah, I guess my next thoughts are, where has perhaps legislation or policy been successful in helping to curb this, or efforts for such policy and regulation?
Are you referring at the federal level, state level, which?
I was kind of casting a big net, hoping for some positive feedback.
Either or both.
Well, it ain't all gloom and doom. I am happy to say that, but it all depends on who's in the White House. That we've had champions over the years on some of the nuclear issues at the federal level, and these are folks who have been, really push hard for a renewable energy future on the one hand, but who have also been arguing very strongly for enhanced nuclear safety. Ed Markey comes to mind as somebody. He's a senator now. When he started out, he was a rep, but he has sat on some of the committees that deal with nuclear energy in Congress, and has always been an advocate for strong regulation and credible regulation. This is a point that we may get into in more detail a little later in the show, but one of the problems we have had is that the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission itself has been so badly co-opted by the nuclear industry as to make them non-credible. In fact, we think NRC stands for not really concerned. That's how bad they've gotten. And there is a legendary moment in history where this actually happened back in the 1990s. There was a senator from New Mexico who was pro-nuclear. His name was Pete Domenici. And he was getting so upset with the then director of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Dr. Shirley Jackson. Her regulatory style was by the book. You know, she actually wanted to follow the regulations. Imagine that. Goodness, a federal agency wanting to follow the regulations. But she did. And this was thwarting some of the plans that Mr. Domenici wanted to push. And he sat her down one day in a room somewhere. I don't know if they shared cigars or not, but he essentially told her, you either back off on your regulatory style or we cut your budget. And from that day forward, the NRC ceased being a regulator and has pretty much been the lapdog for the nuclear industry. Now, you can point to all kinds of regulations they have, and all of these nuclear utilities executives will swear on a stack of phone books that, oh, the NRC is a tough regulator on us, and, you know, maybe they over-regulate. Well, it's just the opposite, because most of the staffers, if you talk to them in Washington, D.C., will tell you that the industry is co-opted and bought out. And it's been so bad that even two of the past Nuclear Regulatory Commission chair people have been saying that the NRC has just not done its job as a safety regulator. So to think that we have any kind of protection with these volumes and volumes of regulation is absurd, unless you want to use them as a radiation barrier and stack them high or something. We have lots of paper, but no implementation that's really meaningful. Now, you wanted something positive, and I know I took you to something negative, but people like Ed Markey and others have been really trying to lean on the NRC to do a better job. So I got to give them credit. You have situations where communities that have been victimized by radiation, now not just reactor communities like we have here in Illinois at Zion, and that's a horror story in its own right, but the Bikini Islanders, for example, and other nuclear victims. There are champions in Congress who are pushing for compensation for those people, trying to get their lands back, trying to get the uranium mines cleaned up in the Southwest and elsewhere. So there are fighters doing this. Excuse me. I want to give a shout out to Senator Tammy Duckworth and to Sean Casten up in the Zion area, because for 4 years now, they have been pushing hard in Congress to get compensation for the community of Zion, which was just devastated when the Zion reactors closed in the late 1990s with no advance warning. They lost their tax base, they lost lots of jobs, and the community went down the toilet and has not been compensated since. So those are two people who are actively trying to fight to undo the wrongs of the past. So they're out there and it is happening. So let me stop at the federal level and we'll take up the state in a little bit. You guys want to react to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask, to what extent could you mute your mic?
Nope, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Is the influence of organizations such as yours pervasive within Washington right now? Like, I mean, is it a higher profile issue than I think the public tends to think of it? In Washington, I mean, are there plenty of lots of conversations about it, or is it something that's just kind of like comes up here and again?
Yeah, it's not a high priority in anybody's book at this point. As you guys pointed out at the beginning of the show and when we were offline, that it's too geeky, it's too arcane, so it doesn't get the priority that a lot of other things do. But now with Biden coming in and him talking about new nuclear plants, smaller ones that are safer, and dealing with the climate issue, it's starting to get elevated again as an important issue. And I want to make a correction before we go on.
Okay.
It was Brad Schneider of the 10th District who actually was championing the Zion community. We'll get to Sean Casten later. But anyway.
Nice. I'm actually very happy to hear that it's Senator Ed Markey, right? That he was able to ward off a big name in the Kennedys. Representative Kennedy was going for a spot, so I'm actually pretty stoked. I put in a little bit of effort for Ed Markey, so cool. All right, I wasn't aware of his stance on this.
And we've had some champions in the Illinois delegation over time too. Jan Schakowsky has just been a stalwart in terms of promoting renewable energy, really holding the industry accountable for its misdeeds. When he was in power, Luis Gutierrez was another one, champion for the people of Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico has an island off its coast, which was used as a testing range for depleted uranium munitions. So he was constantly trying to get that cleaned up. And of course, Chuy Garcia has now taken his place in Illinois and is pretty much taking up where Luis left off. So there are people who are conscientious about this and really want to hold the industry to task.
Are there people within the nuclear industry right now that are coming out commenting about the current status of the nuclear industry, where it's going, that they've made, great strides in technological advances so that it is a lot safer? Any newer science or explanations for these things? I know, like, one solution that isn't a solution, for, like, for example, getting rid of the barrels of waste, is to throw it into a rocket ship and blow it into the sun. The concern is if something goes wrong in the atmosphere with the rocket, everybody's dead. So they don't do that. But so anybody saying, any top-notch scientists saying, like, well, hold on a second here, we actually got some good stuff to tell you? Anything like that going on?
Good stuff for the nuclear people, or
yes.
There are folks out there who are still, selling the snake oil. I'll give you a few examples. One would be Nobel Prize winner Ernest Moniz, who was the former energy secretary under Obama. Very much a pro-nuclear supporter. He's an MIT graduate, a physicist. Nuclear power is the greatest thing since sliced bread, in his book. Yeah. So he's out there hawking around. The one that really grabs my craw probably the most is Dr. James Hansen, who is the climate expert, the atmospheric climate expert, who is now on board for we need more nuclear to solve the climate crisis. I actually had an interesting confrontation with him in Chicago a few years ago, and he kind of stalked away upset. But he's been pushing nuclear, even though, as we pointed out, it's one of the slowest ways of removing carbon from the atmosphere. The current crop, though, of promoters and hucksters are the philanthropists. You have Bill Gates, who is going all over the world and all over public media and private media and every media, talking about his traveling wave reactors and how it's going to eat the nuclear waste up and it's only going to cost you nothing, blah, blah, blah. Well, he did a TED Talk about his reactors a few years back, which was about a half hour long. And you could skip the first 25 minutes until you get to the end, when it gets down to, well, we've got this great design, but it's going to need a lot of government financial support and research and development. And there are going to be a lot of contracts that are going to be, thank you, Bill. It's another cash cow, isn't it? And that's really what it comes down to. Just recently, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a report on these allegedly small, modular, safer reactors, which was pretty blistering in terms of a scientific critique of the problems that they have. But unfortunately, these folks have the ear of the Biden administration and their transition team. So this will be the next fight, is to beat down this next generation of small, in your back pocket nuclear power plants that, will do everything, for you. The Bill Gates thing is particularly funny. That why should we believe that this guy is going to give us a totally safe, cheap nuclear power plant when he was the guy who gave us the Vista operating system for computers a few years ago? I'm sorry, I can't buy.
That's funny.
Oh, by the way, he announced he and his wife are divorcing. I don't know if you heard that.
Yeah, it's huge news. I mean, somebody needed something else to read about and hear talk about after the whole, Philip dying thing, whatever it was. Anyway, Calvin.
Yeah. Thank you for adding to the terrible list of things that Bill Gates does. He's an exploitative billionaire, and I really don't like him. So it just reaffirms it. I'm wondering if I might pivot from the exploitative billionaire to the local that you mentioned before. I'm big into labor. I'm really big into democratizing systems. So worker cooperatives work a lot for me. And I know some energy companies are worker cooperatives. I was wondering if you could talk about what you meant in regards to local. And I've got my fingers crossed that these worker cooperatives and labor unions are on board with this. But sometimes that doesn't always line up. So I'm hopeful.
So that's really taking us into the realm of the state legislation that's happening right now. And as I pointed out earlier in our talk here, that was dominated for 50 years by both Commonwealth Edison and Exelon on the one hand, and Michael Madigan on the other hand. And when you speak of Michael Madigan, you also have to talk about labor, because that was a pretty tight alignment over many, many years between the two of them. So those three control the energy dialogue forever. That unraveled over the last 2.5 years, obviously. So a lot of things are changing, except the fact that Exelon is once again coming back for more nuclear bailouts because they claim they can't run their plants at a profit. In 2016, they were given $2.35 billion bailout for 3 reactors that they claim were losing money in Illinois. So over a 10-year period, they were going to get bailed out. Us ratepayers became the ATM machine for Exelon's shareholders for these reactors that weren't making enough money for Exelon. Well, this year, now they're claiming that the 2 operating Dresden nuclear plants southwest of Chicago and the 2 Byron plants, which are southwest of Rockford, Illinois, are also financially distressed, not making enough money, and need to be bailed out, or they're going to be shut down. And this was the threat that they used back in 2016 for the other 3 that they got bailed out. If you don't pay up, we will shut down the reactors, and there goes all those workers and jobs and tax base and whatever. So I'm leading into a template of operation that has to be destroyed if we're going to move forward. And unfortunately, labor plays a positive and a negative role in this. So we dub this the nuclear hostage crisis. Give us the money or we shoot this puppy is what it translates to. And in this case, it was give us the bailouts or we shut down the reactors and you lose not just your tax base and your jobs, but when they usually bring this up, it happens to be an election year, so you lose your votes. And of course, legislators would respond to this. So what we're trying to get across now is you've got to break that cycle. And one of the unfortunate perpetuators of the cycle are the very strong labor unions that are employed at the power plants themselves. And I would say not just nuclear plants, but this extends in some degree to the fossil plants, because you have the pipe fitters, the boiler, people who deal with steam and boilers are there, and certainly the IBEW. Ultimately, the AFL-CIO has weighed in on current legislation. And again, they're calling for bailouts. But at least this time, they're calling for what we referred to earlier as just transitions to help the communities weather through the transition. On the other hand, because labor is not a monolith, you do have unions which are opposing bailouts. That would be like SEIU, for example, the teachers' unions. More of the service sector people and the service sector unions are not in favor of bailouts because they're more in favor of the community-based approach to energy, the small distributed power stations working on energy efficiency projects where the jobs are more liberally sprinkled, not just around the state, but in the communities that really need those jobs, the BIPOC communities, the communities that have already been negatively impacted by energy, from being there before. So it's not a black and white thing. It's not an either or, and labor is not a monolith, but they certainly have a powerful role to play. What we had hoped back in 2014 when we first started pointing out this flaw of the nuclear hostage crisis was that labor would understand, number one, the nuclear plants will close because unlike coal plants and gas plants, they have an operating license which expires. And we know exactly what day, time, season it's going to happen. So if you don't protect your brothers and sisters in advance with a just transitions program when those plants close, for sure they're going to be out of jobs. You're not going to have a tax base. But they didn't do anything about it back in 2014, 15, and 16. Now I think they're seeing the light that the nuclear age is over, and they have to start protecting their brothers and sisters, in labor. And so they also are starting to call for the just transitions pieces, in some ways much more liberally even than we are. But it's a situation now where labor will play an important role. In fact, the labor put together a coalition of groups which put forth a bill. It's the Clean Union Jobs Act, Climate Union Jobs Act, CUJA, which will be one of the bills that will be debated and discussed in the next 30 days before the session ends in Springfield. But it's under a lot of competition. The Enviros put out a bill called the Clean Energy Jobs Act. Last week, Governor Pritzker dropped a bill into the hopper. So there's going to be 7 major bills that have to be thrown into the legislative Vegematic to come up with an energy plan of the future. So labor is going to play a role in that, but they need to understand that at least when it comes to the nuclear plants and certainly the fossil plants, it's game over. And they better start thinking in terms of how do you protect job transition to different economies and also bring in more of the new era energy jobs in renewables, in energy storage, in the new kinds of grids and transmission lines that we're going to need to power a renewable energy and energy efficient energy system of the future.
That's interesting. Okay. Talk more about alternatives to nuclear. Would you mic here? Or mute mic?
Whoops.
No, it's okay. It's hard to get used to. I get it. About the alternatives like solar, hydro, wind, things like that. Because I think part of the criticism against those, I know that some people have said that solar alone could possibly give us about 2% of our energy needs. And it's kind of like that. Even I don't know about the rest of them and all of them put together or anything like that. But the criticism against them compared to nuclear is that they're just not going to cut it. Go ahead. You can take your mic on.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, and it suffers from the GIGO phenomenon. The garbage assumptions you put into statements like that will determine the garbage results you get out at the other end. So it depends on whose experts you talk to, first of all. Technologically speaking, there is no barrier to a 100% renewable energy system. We have terrific and ever-growing efficiencies in both solar and wind, which are getting better almost annually. That's how rapid the changes are taking place. We're doing a better job at transmission and moving the power around when it's needed, where it's needed than ever before, thanks to computerization, but also thanks to different understandings of how better to transmit the power. Now, can we do it? It depends. What timeline are you talking about? Can we do it tomorrow? No. Can you do it by 2030, which the governor suggests for coal plants? Well, he's going to shut down the coal plants, so we have to. Can we get to renewables by 2050? The answer is definitely yes. In fact, we think we could do it even faster. But we have to take into the reality that all of the stonewalling and the obstructionism that the fossil utilities and the nuclear utilities like Exelon have put into place over the years is a barrier. So it's not so much a technological problem as a self-fulfilling prophecy that we've painted ourselves in the corner. So we're starting from 5 yards behind the start line, thanks to those guys. So we have more ground to pick up in a shorter time frame. That's the real problem. That's the real argument. We can do it, but it's going to be more expensive now because we were stupid and didn't incrementally add it when we should have. Now we have to add it quick to deal with the climate crisis. And as everyone knows, when you're dealing with an emergency surgery, it's a lot more expensive than when you plan something out ahead of time and you do something like better nutrition in advance. That's kind of the situation we're in. Now, this show is being taped on or being aired on the 5th of May. Last week, we invited in Mark Jacobson, who is a professor at Stanford University in California, who has done a state-by-state analysis of not whether we can get to 100% renewables, but how you can achieve that. And in a couple of days, we'll have the edited version of that upline, and we'll be glad to share that with people so they can hear what Mark had to say last Thursday. But looking at his chart, which I attempted to send earlier, and I'm not sure if you guys ever got it by email, his breakdown for Illinois would go something like this. Now, these are figures that are 5 years old, and he amended them last week when he gave his presentation. 5 years ago, he was saying onshore wind in Illinois can provide roughly 60% of Illinois' energy electrical needs. He claims that would be a little bit higher now for a number of reasons. In the last 5 years, the efficiencies of the turbines have gotten better. The transmission situation is slightly better. And the expectation is that over time, you will add offshore wind, perhaps off of Lake Michigan, which back in the day was giving 5% in terms of his estimate. That could probably go much higher because offshore wind is much more efficient than onshore wind. So right now, let's just say we're talking 65 to 70% of our electrical needs just from wind power. He estimated solar would provide 26% of Illinois power, but there too, efficiencies in solar have expanded greatly in the last 5-6 years when these numbers were cranked. So there's a very good chance that that can be improved on. And he also had residential rooftop solar as roughly 3%. That too could be expanded upon because of the improvements, again, in the solar panels themselves, and because of this new legislation that is coming out probably at the end of this month in May, which is going to start pushing community solar projects to be bigger, better, and more widely distributed around the state. So right there, we're talking almost 90-some percent or 95% of the electrical demand for energy. And the last piece was the commercial and government rooftop solar. Same arguments apply there. Is, the efficiencies of those will become greater. You have more control if it's a government rooftop solar program. Like, for example, the city of Chicago could make an ordinance up which would demand that solar be built into every library or every city facility, and it's not now. So these are areas that we can use current day technology and make things work. Now, what's missing from this, and this is something we didn't get a chance to discuss with him, is the notion of the demand for electricity. My previous background was in community mental health, and I know that there's a difference between demand and need. In fact, any grandparent would know the difference between demand and need, because we know what our grandchildren need, but what they demand, 5 ice cream scoops for every dinner, is not necessarily a good idea. So this idea of demand for electricity has a really interesting parallel, because we waste so much of the electricity we already generate. The solution when you have a leaky energy bucket is not to get a bigger bucket. It's to stop pumping and wasting, get a bucket that doesn't leak. So that's the situation that needs more further refinement and better analysis, is how much of the energy that we are currently demanding and using can be gotten away, can be done away with through better efficiency. And this is really a gold mine that people like Amory Lovins at the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado have been championing for 40 years, that the American economy is still too wasteful. Your cheapest and best route to energy production is to not produce the electrons at all and just be more efficient with what you use. Right. So taken as a conglomerate, reducing this so-called demand, improvements in efficiencies and capacities of renewable technology, and the wider implementation of these statewide, which have huge economic benefits for the state, lead us to think that it's definitely achievable in Illinois. We would say by 2040, not even by 2050.
That's promising. And just want to say real quick, shout out hello to Abdul Jones, who's tuning in here. Hello, Abdul. Thanks for tuning in. There's a lot to be said about everybody's personal accountability. It's one of the platforms for the Green Party is personal and global accountability. One of the reasons we have land pollution is because people throw stuff on the ground. And each individual needs to stop doing that. That kind of thing. We always kind of we tend to there's so many people involved and enough blame to go around. But people, kind of do certain things and then go, hey, government, what are you going to do to fix it? Well, first thing is, shut your lights off when you're not using them. For example, your ACs when you don't need them, and then, so on and so forth. Everybody's responsible to participate in fixing what's wrong, for sure. I want to go back into a little bit more about, we only got about 10, 15 minutes left here. I want to talk more about the Illinois legislators. Do you have any people you'd like to name that are really on board with I know you mentioned Tammy Duckworth and before. What about Joyce Mason? Is she doing anything as far as this whole thing goes?
Representative Mason is up in the Zion area, and she actually introduced some legislation a couple of years ago, which we had begun work on with her predecessor. But it was a piece which very pointedly called for more accountability for Exelon in terms of reporting the decommissioning costs that they were doing at the Zion reactor at the time. Our state is very loose in some of the regulations. In fact, there's some regulations that are totally absent. So she's been a champion of that. She has worked very closely, I know, with Senator Melinda Bush from that area. Mm-hmm. And the two of them have been champions of just transitions, which is essential moving forward in energy. So, both of those people are two people that come to mind, having worked with them for years now up in the Zion area. Generally speaking, there are a lot of folks that are environmental champions on renewables. You have Robin Gable, for example, in Evanston. Ann Williams in Chicago, who is the sponsor of the Clean Energy Jobs Act in the House here. That's the environmental bill that's moving forward. Downstate, you have really strong advocates like Representative Amans, I think in the Bloomington Normal area. There are folks out in the Peoria area as well. The names escape me right now, but yeah, there are folks who get it, that this is a transformative time. We've got to make this jump. We've got to be environmentally sensitive, but also environmentally just in how we make the transition. And they have worked really hard and put in the homework to develop these programs and make them in a format that will be voted on very soon. We'll see if we get that or not. And I would even say, I know the environmental community has been very happy with Chris Welch coming in as the Speaker's replacement, Madigan's replacement as Speaker of the House. He is a co-sponsor of CEJA and is a very strong advocate of renewable energy. So yeah, there are champions out there. On the renewables front, Senator Don Harmon, the current president of the Senate, has been a champion of renewable energy for a long, long time. No question of that. It's just been, up until recently, the big barriers, the big three, Madigan, Exelon, and ComEd, and to a certain extent, entrenched labor have really slowed down the process. Now we're going to see. It's put up or shut up time, and we'll see if these folks can deliver.
Well, yeah, let's hope that they do deliver and deliver soon, because again, there's urgency in all these things. Calvin, did you have anything?
I think I have two quick ones. I want to talk about direct action as well as electoral action. So direct action, I think, would be a really good call for citizens to talk with their communities, share this video, and there's a YouTube channel for the NEIS, and I suggest that they share all that great information as well. I was watching some of those today. And electorally, we could, and there might be a source for this somewhere, we could be contacting our state legislators to pursue either amendments to certain bill proposals or to back certain bill proposals that are workable. What do you think of those direct actions and electoral moves?
Now is the time. The word we're getting is that over the next 3 weeks, this energy bill is going to come together in some form. Now, I mentioned there are 7, or maybe I didn't, but there are 7 major bills that have been introduced. The governors, CJA, KUJA, on and on and on. Over 4,000 pages of energy legislation has been introduced, and they've got 3 weeks to come up with an energy bill. So, yes, now is the time. Now, I have to put out a few disclaimers and things like that. My organization, being a nonprofit, we can't endorse candidates, and we have to be very careful about legislation as well. Regrettably, we have not been able to formally support any of the pieces of legislation that are out there because in some way, shape, or form, each of them supports a nuclear subsidy or a nuclear bailout in some way. We cannot support that. So what we have chosen to do as an organization, instead of endorsing a particular bill or whatever, is advise our legislators of what has to be in a final product, because we know it's going to go in the Vegematic, and 4,000 pages of something is going to get reduced to a bill by May 31st. So we have been advocating certain pieces should appear. The first is no nuclear bailouts. You cannot create an energy future by bailing out the past. So sorry, Exelon, it's a business decision. You want to close them, close them. If they're yours, not ours. We shouldn't be your ATM machine. The second, though, is there has to be an aggressive build out of renewables, efficiency, and energy storage. And that may be costly, but it's one of those deals where you may pay a little bit more now, but down the road, it pays off in savings. That may be hard to swallow after a year of COVID and a tough economy. But again, that has a lot to do with the obstruction of Exelon and Madigan in the past. We got to deal with it now. So that's the second piece. The third absolutely essential piece is whatever bill comes out must contain the environmental justice components and the equity components that are in the Clean Energy Jobs Act or the governor's bill. Those are the only 2 bills that address the injustices of energy in any meaningful way. There's a lot of hard work that's been put in by community groups, by labor organizations, by activists, by environmentalists that have real sound programs being proposed to make sure that we get environmental justice for BIPOC communities, for communities that have already been affected by plant closures, by mining, pollution, whatever. Those 3 things are essential in a final energy product. If we don't get those, then we've wasted a lot of time and money, and quite frankly, we're going to be not only ruining the environment, because we're going to have climate disruption continuing, but we're going to be ruining any economic chances that we can make this work.
And I wanted to follow that up real quick, and to also ask people to speak with the union member in their community or in their family. I think it's important that you speak with the union members. Labor is a part of the community, and we're all part of the working class in solidarity. So this does concern us all, and I think it's worth a conversation. So make sure you bring it up with people. The other quick question I had was a suggestion from my friend. Growing up in college, going for his doctorate, he said that more and more people, especially doctors, because of his field, need to pursue at least a stint in politics, rather than having your regular politician, poli-sci major, take somebody who is an expert in the field and have them run for a position. It could be local, and then you're going to have that excellent perspective. Somebody who knows how to go through the research papers and really find the answers that we all need. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that, and then I'll write out the rest of the show.
Okay. Well, actually, to a lesser extent, I guess I'm kind of a model of what you just said, because I came out of a community mental health background. That's what I was doing before I helped co-found NEIS back in 1981. So my training was actually in clinical psych. And a little story here, one day when I was sitting around my office at the mental health center, as I was just getting into this issue, I looked at our diagnostics manual for mental disorders and whatever, and I happened to look at the ones for substance abuse, alcohol and drugs. And every word that term was there for drug or alcohol, I substituted the word electricity. And to my horror, the clinical definition still worked, which said to me, suggested to me, we are energy addicts. So I relate this to you because it is a different way of looking at the issue, like you're pointing out. Whenever I've engaged the state on issues like radioactive waste management and storage, there are no sociologists at the table. There are no people who discuss community development or planning. It's all kinds of, nuclear physicists and techno geeks and stuff like that. We do have to understand that this is a bigger holistic issue. In fact, we've always said nuclear power is not about energy. It is a societal issue which has many facets, and energy is one component of that. But there are other aspects that we have to start valuing. In fact, our whole ethical system needs to be brought into the discussion because it's been largely ignored. If we were really paying attention to ethical considerations and morality, we wouldn't have 15,000 abandoned and unremediated uranium mines sitting on Dene lands in the southwestern United States. Wow. So you're right. We have to bring in new voices and new perspectives on this, just like we're going to have to do with genetic engineering and modification and GMO foods. This has to be everybody's choice, and we're going to have to ourselves become smarter to the best we can, but bring in new voices from other areas of expertise. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
Very cool. Yes, I'm a big champion for morality myself. I have a philosophy degree, so I studied ethics, and it's very dear to me. And it's unfortunate to see that most people, especially in politics, that they don't really consider ethics as primary. When in fact, moral value underpins everything everybody does all the time. Every single aspect of your behavior is underpinned by some sort of virtue or vice, period. That's it. And I can easily explain that some other day. But we're at about the end of our show here. Real quick, I just want to ask you one more question. You're kind of alluding to it, but not actually saying it. So I just wanted to see if I can get a more explicit answer. Is this nuclear power, not nuclear missiles, nuclear power issue, is it politically binary? Like, is it one of those things like if you're a Democrat, you think it's a problem. If you're a Republican, you love it. That kind of thing.
I wouldn't say that.
Okay.
I would say that if you're a Republican, you really love it. If you're a Democrat, a lot of you sort of love it, and the rest of you hate it.
Okay.
But I'm having problems with my machine here, so we have extra noise. I'm sorry. I would have to say, look, cut the crap and get rid of the labels. Labeling is a shortcut to thinking. You've got to look at the data, the issues, as you pointed out, the ethics, the morality. What kind of a society do you want? What kind of justice do you want? And then examine nuclear power in that context. I will work with anybody. Almost anybody. Not Trump or Putin, forget it. But no. The idea is, we have to re-examine it from a different perspective, and you got to cut the crap with the politics. It just doesn't work anymore. Gotcha.
Well, okay, we're at the end of our show. Mr. David Kraft, thank you so much for coming on and informing us, enlightening us on this very important issue. It was a great effort by Anna to get you on the show, and thank you, Anna, if you're still listening. This is awesome. This is extremely fun. Like I said, specifically referring to nuclear war and that kind of thing. People just don't think about nuclear stuff anymore. They think it's just this thing from the 50s and it's over and we're fine. Yes, we have them. I know people that know somebody that's actually still building nuclear silos in Germany. So it's not the proliferation. That's a bunch. That the whole fact that they're trying to take it down. I don't know how true that is. But anyway, thank you, everybody. Calvin, do you have any last words, sir?
I just want to say thank you so much, Dave. I found this to be super informative, and you are you're low key funny. You threw in some good laughs there, and I really like that. Thank you so much.
It's such a deadly issue. We try and liven it up now and then as best we can. So
I think you did great.
thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Humor is also considered a virtue by Aristotle, too, by the way. It's always fun. It's always good to take a time to laugh.
Well, Mark Twain once said that in the face of humor, nothing can withstand it. So
there you go. I love that. Everybody, thank you for tuning in to Green Party series. I am your host, David Rych. My co-host, Kelvin Tomaschko. Tonight's guest, David Kraft, the co-founder of NEIS. Great show tonight, guys. Till next week, everybody, be good and be green.
See ya.